Well, where did we get our morality from? Where do we get it from? So up to this point, we have looked at the definition of ethics, and now we are in the midst of the ethical system. And this is the part 2 right here, ethical system. Now, broadly speaking, ethical systems fall into 2 categories. You remember those? The first one is non-absolutisms, and the second one is absolutisms. Now, those words are very important, non-absolute and absolute. The first category, non-absolute, is your antinomianism and your situationism and your generalism, and we'll discuss that. The next one are your absolutes, which is unqualified absolutism, conflicting absolutism, and graded absolutism. These are going to be a blast. I'm telling you, this is my most favorite part, are the absolutisms, or the absolute category. Okay, but before we get there, first category, non-absolutisms or relativism. So when you think of non-absolutes, just automatically in your mind think of relative. That's how they think. Ethical system, it's relative. Relative based on what? Well, they have all kinds of criteria. The first one that we already looked at is the category of antinomianism, which literally means against or instead of law. Remember what we looked at from the Greek here? If you recall here, nomos means law, right? Antinomianism, no law, exactly, no law. So, antinomianists are people who have no law. In the New Testament and Old Testament, if you're looking at the Old Testament Septuagint, which is the Greek, which translates in 280 BC, and anytime you read the Mosaic Law, you always read the word nomos. So that's where that word antinomianism, pneumos, it just comes from the Greek word there. So, also, if you recall, a big player in antinomianism is existentialism. Remember that word? Existentialism, a philosophical movement that stresses the individual's unique position as a self-determining agent. That's the key of existentialism, a self-determining agent, responsible for making meaningful, authentic choices in a universe that is purposeless and irrational. Existentialism, I have the ability to make a decision in an irrational world. Decision based on what I think is right within this purposeless, irrational world. In addition to existentialism, we also looked at evolutionism, which also falls within that category of antinomianism, which tells us that whatever aids the evolutionary process is right. So there's no law that we have to abide by, no absolutes. It's just whatever is aiding the evolutionary process. And your brain can go all different directions on that one. Kill the weak. Isn't that morally wrong? Well, there are no laws. If it helps the evolutionary process, then wipe out the weak. Now, 4 parts of antinomianism. Number 1, there are no God-given moral laws. Right? We already looked at that. Number 2, there are no objective moral laws. Each person can choose to live by some moral standard, and that moral standard is based upon what you think, what I think. What's right for me may not be right for you, but I'm going to live by my own moral standards because there are no absolute standards. Number 3, there are no timeless moral laws. If you remember, the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, "No man steps into the same river twice." Remember that? For fresh waters are ever upon him. So river's running, you step into it, you step out, and you step back into it. The water is new every single time. So that's how he thinks of morality. Morality is in this cycle of change. It's like a water rushing river. It's always changing. There are no absolutes. There's no objective morality. It's all subjective. It's all relative because it's always changing. Number 4, there are no laws against laws. Most antinomians are not. Now, these guys aren't always against the law. They understand that there needs to be civil law. There needs to be civil law because human beings cannot exist in a world where there is no law. We're seeing that in America right now, aren't we? Yes. Anarchy. Yes. And people are killing each other within this anarchy world. So they understand that we need civil laws, but there are no real laws. They're just basic laws that keep us somewhat safe. But then that's relative also. Now, the next one we looked at was situationalism. That's within the category of non-absolutes. Situationalism is located between the extremes of legalism and antinomianism. So antinomianism, if you remember, is no law, and legalism, if you remember, is many laws. So everything's a law. So they kind of find themselves right in the center. And the way that they do this, a situationalist, is that they say, okay, look, there really is no absolute law, but if we had to find an absolute law, it would be the law of love. And love is the only absolute that everything else should be judged by. All we need is love. Get him a mic. Give him a mic. So according to situationism, whatever the conflict of moral norms, they can be dealt with when you appeal to the unbreakable, if you will, or universal law of love. Is murder right? Well, shouldn't we love that person? Let's base murder off of love. Should I steal? Well, do you love those people or not? You know, it's all based on love. Now, let's now go to, this is where we'll begin today. We're still in the category of non-absolutes, and the third one is generalism. So this is our brand new one. Traditionally, those who hold to this ethical system are utilitarians. Are you guys familiar with utilitarians? In the philosophical world, this is a big word that's used often, utilitarians. If you like to watch debates, Christian debates in the philosophical arena, you will hear not only existentialism quite a bit, you'll also hear a lot on utilitarians. So utilitarian is that philosophy that states that an action is justifiable, and this is really important because this is the seat of generalism ethics, and that is this: an action is justifiable if it brings the most amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. That's a utilitarian. It's utility, right? Utility. You're getting something that makes you happy. So whatever brings you the most amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, that's utilitarianism. And that basically is generalism. All right? So some ideas they hold to, number one is this. They hold to the need of norms. They understand that there must be a roadmap to one's ultimate goal. They get that. There's got to be some norms here. There should be some moral system that is consistent. So utilitarians understand that. There must be principles to draw upon which are known to produce good results when followed. So if you can develop a system that produces good results for the majority of people, then that becomes the moral system. Number two, a solution to conflicting norms. Now, this is a big one because when we get into our absolutes, we are going to talk about conflict of morality. Just an example, is it okay to lie to save a life? So we have a conflict of norms, conflict of morality. So from a generalist standpoint, they have a solution to conflicting norms. Generalism offers a solution to the problem of what to do when there is that conflict, and the question is this: what will do the most good? That's the right way to go. So since there really isn't an absolute morality, you can look at what are moral norms and ask yourself which one is the best for the whole or for the most. So a generalist who holds to utilitarian philosophy will say lying to save a life can be right, even though lying is generally wrong. So from their standpoint, lying is generally wrong. Because it's generally wrong because it's a norm that typically hurts somebody else. So you see, that's why it's generally wrong. But because it's a non-absolute in their minds, therefore, if you have to lie to save a life for the greater good of the people, then by all means lie, because it may appear that there's a conflict there, but because they're non-absolutes, there really isn't a conflict. Now later on, we're going to see that when we get into absolutes, we're going to see that there are absolutes. So if there are absolutes and you have two areas of morality that are absolutes and they have a they seemingly conflict, what do you do? So we're going to talk about that. And that's when you pull into theism, and we'll be actually pulling from Scripture to show you the different way. I'll show you the different ways of how they come up with this. John.
What do you do when the majority is wrong?
Well, if the majority is wrong, from a utilitarian perspective or generalism, if you will, perspective, then you always favor in what is going to be the best for people. So it doesn't have to do with the majority, but it has to do with what's going to be best for the most. You see what I mean? So you just try to change the minds of people. Now, they do recognize what they consider an absolute, and that is what is the greatest good. So that's where utilitarians sit themselves. What is the greatest good? And that's how you fix that problem right there. Their thinking is that when moral principles conflict, seemingly moral principles, right, because they're moral norms, but they don't really see them as absolutes. When they appear to conflict, the conflict is not absolute, therefore there's always a possible exception. Yes?
Can you give me something which will right now, an example of what's going on now in our country where this would fall in?
Utilitarianism? Well, utilitarianism is actually a pretty big philosophy amongst people right now. And they will, for example, if they think that taking over a city block is the best for the greater good of the people, then breaking the laws, breaking any moral laws by hurting people or whatever, is appropriate because me blocking off the city block is the best for America. Because if I can take over the city block and I can keep the police out, then maybe this can springboard into other cities. We can defund the police. We can do away with them, then we can live a happy life. That's utilitarianism. What you're seeing up there is a lot of utilitarianism. Yeah. Because their ethical values is non-absolutes. They fall into this non-absolute situation here. Well, it's not situationism, because obviously they're not basing everything off of love, but it is very much generalism, which is utilitarian in the sense that they think that because there are no moral absolutes, therefore let's look at everything from the perspective of what is the greatest good, what do we think is the greatest good for people? So they're willing to break any laws, moral or civil laws, for the greater good of other people. That is the best example. Yep, yeah, it's happening right now. Utilitarianism, what you're seeing in Washington right now. That's at its best. Now, number 3, some generalists have an unbreakable norm. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's an absolute. It's an unbreakable norm. For example, saving lives or keeping promises should always be the normal thing to do. Now, this is only some of the generalists, not all of them. But they kind of consider this kind of an absolute as long as the end or the ultimate goal has been reached, which is the greater good for majority. Therefore, their absolute boils down to an absolute end and not necessarily an absolute norm. You see that? So it's not an absolute moral norm that is important. The absolute is the end, which is the greatest good for everybody else. So what can we do over here in the moral norm area? Can we break it? Can we manipulate it? Can we change it? Because our thinking process, utilitarian thought process is, I'm only looking for the greatest good in the end. So I'll do whatever it takes to get that good. You see the thinking? Do you know anyone who holds this belief system? A lot of people in America do. We're seeing it. Yeah, John.
What is their basis for the greatest good that they are seeking?
Oh, it's subjective and relative. It's whatever they think is a special good. Yeah. Defunding the police department. That's the greatest good for America because now we can pretty much do what we want to do. But what about the people their stores are being looted? What about the people who are getting beaten? And what about property damage?
We have rights, then
So it's the greatest good is their greatest good,
They're good.
which is always subjective and relative, isn't it? Because one person's greatest good isn't always necessarily the other person's greatest. This person, when they were looting his building, he was saying, I worked my whole life. To him, the greatest good was him working hard. He was an older man. He knew what he gave his life to this. This was his store, and he begged and pleaded, don't burn down my building. They went and burned it down because they thought that was the greatest good for America. So you have a conflicting norm here. Which one's right? Well, I guess it depends on who has the majority of people, who has the greatest power at that point. So I think, even with utilitarian thinking, with that philosophy, the ultimate end is the greatest good based upon who has the majority of power. Because if you have a small group who think the greatest good is one thing, they're going to be overrun by the larger group who think the greatest thing is something else. So it doesn't work real well. Crazy people.
It's almost like it feels good to do it.
Oh yeah, there's an awful lot of that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, look at Romans chapter 6, verse 1, if you will. We're going to get into a lot of scripture here in just a little bit, but I want to show you some things here, just in this area. Romans chapter 6, verse 1. And I want you to see this. It says, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase?" This verse, do you think this verse contradicts a generalist ethical system? For example, is lying a sin? Should we sin? Let me read the verse this way. Are we to continue in lying so that grace may increase? The generalist utilitarian says, if it's for the greater good. But how does sin end up for the greater good? James tells us that every time we sin, we give birth to death. So from the utilitarian perspective, generalist perspective, it's okay to lie if the end is for the greater good. But then you have God that says, shall we continue in any sin for the greater good so that grace may increase? No, not by any means. Take a look at Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12, if you would. Proverbs 14, 12. And like I say, a lot of stuff that we're looking at now, we as a Christian, we don't buy into any of this at all. The next stuff we're going to look at is where we find ourselves. But right now, let's take a look at this. Proverbs 14:12. There is a way which seems right to a man. Now tell me if this isn't right now. But its end is the way of death. That's utilitarianism. And even existentialism to a point. I think that this way is the best. Lock it down. This is my city block. I will shoot any trespasser. Or I'm going to do this, even though it hurts this person, I'm going to do it because it's for the greatest good. My way seems right. It's got to be right. And God says, but its end is the way of death every single time. If it's not God's way, then its way will end in death. And that really sums up the last three: Antinomianism, Situationism, and Generalism. Proverbs 14:12 sums up every non-absolute ethical system right there, because they do not see absolutes. And God, the transcendent God, transcendent of time and space, has declared a moral standard that he expects his subjects, humanity, to abide by. Absolutes. And when you ignore the transcendent God who has created a moral system for his subjects, when you ignore that completely, you end up with man thinking he's doing right, but in the end, the way is death. I mean, that really sums it up. Every time. You got it. So there you go. Non-absolutes. Antinomianism. There are no binding moral laws. Everything is relative. Situationism. All we need is love. Generalism. the action that will bring the greatest good to the majority. Pretty interesting, huh? Okay, now let's get into some really cool stuff. Second category is absolutisms. The first one is unqualified absolutism. This is a really neat one. This view is probably, now listen to this. This is important. Unqualified absolutism is probably the one that is most held amongst theists, including Christians. Most Christians in America hold to unqualified absolutism. Now, I'm not going to say if it's good or bad. I want you to think it through. All right? The basic premise of unqualified absolutism is that all moral conflicts are only apparent. They are not real. In other words, moral absolutes never come into conflict with one another. Moral absolutes never come into conflict. For example, is it morally wrong to lie even if a life could be saved? So a moral conflict would be, it is wrong to lie. Okay, so let's do it this way. Let's look at, remember, unqualified absolutism, there are no moral conflicts. So let's look at a seemingly potential conflict. Lie. God said don't do it, right? We don't lie. Now, a conflict is this. Save a life. Save a life. Two moral, well, you can almost say absolutes, right? Lying, moral absolute, don't lie. The value of life, God says don't kill, don't murder. Now, the unqualified absolutists would say that these never conflict. What do you think? Is it always wrong to lie, or can we do it to save a life? Let me ask you that. Now, I'm going to really challenge you here. I'm going to really, really challenge you. What's your thought process, John?
Is there a white lie?
I don't think so. It's called a tiny manipulation. No. Chuck, is it okay to lie? Is it okay to lie to save a life?
The unqualified absolutism, I'd say it's right not to lie, even if someone's died.
Okay, from an unqualified absolutist ethical system, absolutely. Because they never conflict. So if they never conflict, then there's never a problem.
And when we, in a system where God is the unqualified source, then to save that one would be for God.
Is that what you're going to say, Dottie? Yeah. Stephanie? Yeah. So think of this. Think of in Germany. Let's take Poland or Germany. They're hiding the Jews. Anne Frank is in the attic. The Jews come to the door. Or the Germans come to the door. Do you have any Jews? No. Is she lying to save a life? Stephanie?
I know it's all up to God, and I know as a Christian that's what we are supposed to do. But no, I lie to save a life. I know my neighbor.
So what you guys are saying then is that these two do conflict. Unqualified absolutists say that they don't conflict. But you guys are saying that they do conflict. So now, if you have two moral absolutes, how do two absolutes conflict? Chuck?
Forgetting the blood of Christ, that's important.
Yeah, but does that alleviate the fact that we lied
Didn't lie.
to save a life?
Or did lie, either way.
Yeah.
But the blood of Christ, because sin, no matter whichever way you want to look at it, as white or purple or anything small or large,
Yeah.
it's sin.
Yeah. 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 So, the idea unqualified says that they do not conflict, but what we're hearing is that they do conflict. Listen to this. I'm going to read out of Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. Exodus chapter 1, 15 through 20. So this is really challenging because remember, these three ethical systems that we're looking at are all held to some degree by Christians. The one we're looking at now is the most held by Christians. But listen to this. Starting in verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. It was a rough name, I guess. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing? And let the boys live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Did the midwives lie? Absolutely they lied. And the weird thing is God was good to them. Now wait a minute. How is it that we have an absolute morality that God, a transcendent God, told his subjects to never lie, but yet the midwives lied and God was good to them to save a life? Check this out. Turn with me, if you would, to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. I'm hoping we can get at least this one done before 7:30 because I really want to finish this one section up because I don't want to leave it. Okay, Hebrews 13, verse 31. What did I say? 11:31. Thank you. Hebrews 11:31. Hebrews 11:31. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. Do you remember the situation here? Rahab, her lie saved the Jewish spies. You remember? And she is commended for faith in Hebrews. So the question is, did God bless in spite of their lie, not because of it? Did God bless because he showed mercy, not because of their lie? So did he bless because they lied? Or did he show mercy and bless even though they lied? Could it be that we don't need to lie ever because the ultimate reality is that God is sovereign and therefore controls the end result of the situation? Can God intervene in a situation and fix the problem without us lying? Or do we need to lie? The Germans are at the door. They're asking where Anne Frank is. They're asking where your family is. Do we say, I'm not going to lie. They're upstairs. God intervene. I mean, Rahab, she was in that position. The midwives, they were in that position. Pharaoh would have killed them. So they were there. Chuck?
I would make some of those same choices, but what I think God initially wants us to do is that in the Garden of Eden, he said, do not eat from the tree of knowledge, good and evil. And they did. And now we're deciding what is good and what is evil. And actually, the decision should be God's.
But these are absolutes. They're absolute.
Should be God's.
A moral ethical system that is, Chuck, but we better create a new one here. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So an absolute is something that can't be broken. That shouldn't be broken under God's law. Look at this. Here's some major premises of unqualified absolutes. This may help. At least help with this thinking process. So here, premise number one. God's unchanging character is the basis of moral absolutes. I think we would agree with that. God does not change. He has created a moral standard. Therefore, moral standards do not change. Do you see the logic? God is unchanging. Therefore, morality does not change. Number two, God has expressed his unchanging moral character in his law. So God has given us a law that tells us of his moral character. I think we would agree with that. Number three, can God contradict himself? No, so he can't contradict his moral standards that he's already placed, his absolutes. Number four, no two moral laws can really conflict. That's unqualified absolutism says this. There might be a situation, but these never conflict with one another. And that's where we seem to differ a little bit here. Because we're thinking, some of us are thinking that these do conflict. But if they're both absolute standards, how therefore do they conflict? Yes?
You have a choice whether to lie or whether to tell the truth. You can choose to not speak.
So you can just lay down your own life.
And then they come.
Yes. Good point.
Walk out of here tonight and say, yeah, I turned in.
Yeah. This is a tough one, isn't it? I mean, this is tough. This is real deal here. Number five, all moral conflicts are only apparent, not real. So from the unqualified absolutist ethical system, they say that this looks like a conflict, but it's only apparent. It's not a real conflict. There's a way out of this. Let me give you some positive aspects of this system. It is based on God's unchanging nature. That is, moral law is anchored in God's fixed character and therefore never changes. So that's a good aspect of this. It's universal and it's constant. So this is worldwide. Number two, it stresses rule over result. Did you hear that? It expresses rule over the result of what could happen. Unqualified absolutism is called a deontological ethic. That is, rule. Now here's the port. This is what a deontological ethic is. Rule is the basis of the act. Rule is good regardless of the result. They may kill, they may come in and kill, but I will not change. I cannot change from the absolute rule. You see that? Rule determines the result. What is the result of me not lying? It will be based upon the rule, don't lie. I don't know what the result's going to be, but I know that I cannot lie. Therefore, the result will be based off of the rule that I'm holding on to. That's what they say. Something is not good just because it brings about a desired result. Remember, the Utilitarian says it's good if the end is good for humanity or for the majority. Unqualified absolutism says that an act is good because it is good regardless of the result. It is always the rule. So whatever the result is from me not lying is good. Number three. Whatever results from me not lying is good. Well, that's the premise. Well, I'm not. That's the premise of unqualified absolutism, the ethical system we're looking at. That's one of their premises, is this. What is good is a result of you holding to the rule of not lying. Even though it doesn't look good, something is unqualified absolutism. It's not good because the end result appears good. It's good because you held to the rule, the moral rule. It's challenging, isn't it? Does it make you think? Yeah. Best thing to do is just run for your life all the time. I'm not answering a thing, yeah. Number 4. Drive people to... Oh, my goodness. The 4th premise. This may help clarify them a little bit more. The 4th premise is this. There is always a way to avoid sinning. Is that true? Something to think about, right? So the unqualified absolutist says that it is never necessary to sin. Never. No matter what situation you find yourself, it's never necessary to sin because God gave absolutes. Yeah, but did God necessarily approve of that? Look, turn with me, if you would, to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. Dave.
I'm reminded of the children of Israel on their trip to Canaan, and one of the men brought in a woman from one of the nations that they were to have no contact with and took her into his tent. And another man went in and ran a spear through the both of them and killed them. What did God have to say about that? Said it was a good act and it saved a great deal of judgment coming on the community.
And there was a murder, which was an absolute. Exactly. Double murder, absolute, don't murder. But here you have an instance of God saying that it's saved. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Unqualified absolutes say that it is never necessary to sin. So let's take what we're thinking here and let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. So, if you have absolutes, unqualified ethics says you never have to sin. Never do you have to break one of those. Even though we see the examples in Scripture. They're saying that you don't have to. So yes, Sheila.
The Anne Frank analogy confuses me just a little bit because we know the end result is that somebody did tell on them. She did die in a concentration camp. Not the whole family, but she did.
Not initially, though.
Right.
Yep.
So she lived a little while longer, but the end result was the same.
It was. Good point. Good point. Let me share with you, just for a couple more minutes here, as we conclude this section, and next week we'll look at the other two, some problems with this particular ethical system. For example, thou shalt not murder. From an unqualified absolute position, killing is wrong no matter the situation. But if someone attacks your family with the intent of killing them, and you defend them and kill the person, is it wrong? It doesn't fall under the category of murder, does it? So capital punishment isn't considered murder then. Well, capital punishment by the state, government. Oh. So let me ask you this then. When a foreign country attacks your country, Is it morally right to defend your country by killing the opposition? So in unqualified ethics, the answer is no. Unqualified ethical system, unqualified absolutism, says that there are moral standards that never conflict. So if God says do not murder, never would you murder what they would consider murder, taking a life. Whether it's defending your house or defending your country or putting to death somebody for capital punishment. Lying is morally wrong, but when you go on vacation and leave the lights on in your house with the intent of making it look like someone is there, is that morally wrong? But the intent is to make it look like somebody's there when no one is really there. So unqualified ethics would say that that's a lie and should never conflict. Therefore, you can't have a moral conflict. Therefore, always follow the rule. Never worry. The rule. Never. What am I saying here? Always follow the rule in spite of the result. The rule will give the result. You don't get the result and then think of the result and then base it off of, or then formulate a rule. See what I mean? How many people do that? How many Christians leave the lights on and have them flicker, make it look like somebody's in the house when nobody's there? We do it to deter a thief. Absolute, or the unqualified absolutist would say that's wrong. So, let me leave you with this question. Can a Christian be morally right by breaking a moral law? Let me say it again. Just think about it. Can a Christian be morally right by breaking a moral law? Moral law, God's moral law, which is an absolute. From an unqualified absolutist perspective, the answer is no. So take what we've looked at today, and this is the majority of what Christians believe, is what we just studied. We're going to look at two more next week. And then take what we've learned today, match it up with what you say God is saying, and then compare it with the other two that we're going to look at next week, and see where you find yourself in this ethical system of absolutes. It gets pretty tough. Any final questions before we pray and end? Yes.